Gordon Greenberg is the director of the new musical, The Heart of Rock and Roll on Broadway. I'm David Buchanan with Gold Derby. Gordon, I wanted to start by asking you, this show is such an homage to the 80s, from the music to the visual style and aesthetic. Was there a particular kind of cultural touchstone from that time that really influenced your work on the show and inspired you to, as you were crafting this musical?
Yeah, it's funny. When I first read the earliest draft, I think it was nearly a decade ago, that John sent me, it was very, very different from this. But I think what we both shared was a love for those movies we grew up with in the 80s, the John Hughes movies, St. Elmo's Fire, um, all the way through to, Less Than Zero. Um, all of them shared what now feels like an innocence, but I think at that point felt horribly sophisticated. Even Ferris Bueller felt like, a very edgy young man to me. And he became my hero, my folk hero in high school. Um, and I wanted to bring that style, that effervescence, and that kind of generosity of spirit to the show. You know, I have a love for theater, a love for working on pieces as diverse as Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which I did last year, the Geffen, to this, and everything in between. And I just felt like at this moment in the country, in the world, there's so much darkness, so much division, so much, as my parents would say, sorus, that I thought it was time, to kind of share a bit of optimism and kindness and silliness and music that makes your hair on the back of your neck stand up a little bit and makes you leave the theater a little lighter than when you came in. So all of those were the ultimate goal, a delivery of joy, and buoyancy and fizz. But getting there, as you know, is easier said than done. Just because you break some eggs doesn't mean you're making a meringue. And we broke a lot of eggs, and some of them ended up on the floor and in compost. But a lot of them ended up in the show. And over the years, primarily through our key development out at the Old Globe, with Barry Edelstein, we found a core to this, a core humanity and truth in the characters that allowed us to keep making them deeper and truer. And as I always say, kind of growing roots, not necessarily branching. And as we understood who each person was and what they wanted, we were able to peel away the things that didn't add to the story. So, it's the old, if I had the time, I would have written a shorter letter. So it took 10 years to make a 2-hour musical that wasn't 5 hours of big ideas and fabulous music. We had to pick just the key moments and the key pieces that really forwarded the story and had the energy roller coaster that you want to create with a show like this, where you're taking the audience and lifting them up and trying to keep the ball in the air and giving them enough breath to sort of make their way into a character's heart and head, but always to stay just slightly ahead of them in the plot, and also tonally to find this place that is truthful but winking, like a lot of the John Hughes movies, that you believe in your character, you believe in the story you're telling, but you also know that it's kind of nutty and silly at the same time. Sorry, I answered your question in 15 different ways, but
No, it's terrific. And there, you touched on so many things I want to ask you about, one of which is that long development process. You mentioned the production at the Old Globe. What changed most between that production and bringing it to Broadway? Like, what, for folks who didn't get to see it there, like I did not, what would you say was the biggest change that you made between then and now?
Well, the first wholesale change was that it took place in the vague now. When we did it out there, we didn't specify a time period, but moving into the 80s was something I felt was what the show wanted. And it took a bit of time for us to convince all of our producing partners on it. But once everybody got on board, we really kind of embraced it. It just did wonders for the show, and it made sense of a lot of the plot and a lot of the people, and it gave a whole other almost layer of remove that allows you to enjoy the show without thinking it's supposed to reflect our current reality. It's like Mamma Mia. It all takes place on the tropical island of itself, um, and that's this world. I mean, the whole thing takes place. I wanted to set it all in the equivalent of Mamma Mia, colorful and kind of, I always say, like a pool you want to dive into. So in this, it's this um, kind of imaginary version of the Drake Hotel in Chicago, which is an old grand dam on Lake Michigan. And as someone who grew up in New York and didn't even know Chicago existed until I was maybe 20, um, I have this romanticized vision of it because it's so beautiful and clean and democratic and open, not politically democratic, but just egalitarian. It feels like a place anyone can access. Um, and we created a Grand Budapest Hotel version of the Drake. Um, and I just thought creating that world, finding actors that believed in this tonally, and then finding ways to cheekily remind the audience that we're all in on the joke. Those were all kind of key to moving it into the 80s and transporting it to an even more juicy and kicky kind of fizzy place. So that was probably the biggest change into the Globe. Then there were lots of plot changes, and some of which I'll specify, but I would say certainly the inciting incident was another thing that we talked about a lot, and understanding that his move gets him fired, and then he has something to struggle back from. Immediately engages the audience, and that was another thing that there was some talk about. But I love making changes. I'm a tinkerer. I'm a Rubik's Cube equivalent worker when it comes to theater and new plays and musicals. And I always feel like we have the other version. We can always go back to that, but why not keep trying? As long as the actors are game and still have some neuroplasticity in them, we can keep working. And that's what we did. And thank goodness, because working with Jonathan is just such a joy. He's become like a brother, and I adore his heart and mind and kindness and optimism. And it really is, this has been such a joyful, excellent process, that all I have is, at the risk of sounding super Hollywood cliche, treacly, gratitude. It's such an overused word now, but I really am happy and thankful for everybody on this process. I was, when I was 12, I used to come into the city and make my parents drive me in from the suburbs and take pictures of me under the marquees of every show. Shenandoah, Evita, Annie. And it's all these like little snapshots of me. I don't know why, but I got a kick out of it. And to be making the shows is really something. It's a privilege that I never take for granted.
Yeah, you mentioned how joyful the show is, and I think so much of that is how you stage it, and so much of that is Huey Lewis and the News music. I mean, it's just such uplifting and fun and joyful music. I wanted to ask you, there's so many unique things that you and Jonathan have done with these songs, changing their context. Obviously, it's an entirely new story that you're working these songs into. So two questions on that. First, what is your favorite sequence that you worked on, that you took a song, gave it a new kind of perspective in the show? And also, what was the most challenging to stage? I mean, it's so innovative and clever the way you bring these musicals and these songs into this new story and new musical. Was there one that was particularly kind of challenging to crack?
Well, we tried Stuck With You. We tried in many different ways. It was part of his a cappella or doo-wop group. We're meant to think that Tucker, who's kind of the Ted McGinley of this world, is a part of Whiff and Poof's kind of, I forget, are they the Tiger Tones in Princeton? We call them the Undertones. And we tried it straightforward. We tried it as a big dance number. And then I finally kind of had this notion that if we were looking at the Stepford Wives idea of what his perfect life would be and what our protagonist, Cassandra, one of our protagonists, thinks she wants. It's everything that's on her spreadsheet, in her life plan, and he shows it to her in stark, bold colors and clear contrast to this other person that she's been sort of um, fascinated by. It makes her decision really clear. And so we went from that baseline idea that, like, how do we spell out what she's headed for, and then once we put it up, we kept amplifying it and amplifying and putting a funhouse mirror on it. And I just thought about, what my sister calls the wine moms, um, and because she's a mom and she's got an adolescent child in LA, and the reality of that, in whether it's Connecticut or LA or Chicago or Winnetka or wherever they are, um, is that there was a lot to satirize in it, and so that became just a joyful thing. And then we threw in, some little bits from Single White Female, which weirdly the next show I'm working on for London as a play, but that's going to be a serious thriller. Anyway, it was great fun, and playing with what this absurdly, sort of self-satisfied and privileged guy, kind of what his approach is. When he starts with a little ukulele, I just sort of thought that was adorable.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up that number, because that kind of, I don't know if you would call it pantomime or how exactly you would describe it, but it's so fun and unexpected. I want to also ask you about, two of the standout moments, I think, and stand out because of the performances and because of the simplicity of how you stage them, which is we kind of get these two 11 o'clock numbers, one for Cassandra and certainly one for Bobby in It Hit Me Like a Hammer and The Only One. I just love how much, kind of room you give those songs to breathe, and those performers, Mackenzie Kurtz and Corey Cott, to perform them. What was the inspiration for letting those moments just kind of live on the stage and breathe in that way? Because I think it really takes restraint to just let them, stand and deliver those songs so perfectly.
Well, I think they both have such rich, soulful inner lives, as actors and as characters. We've been watching them build up and build up throughout the evening. You couldn't have done that, and I wouldn't have done it in Act One, where we're not really there yet. But by Act Two, there's a lot that we want to unpack. And if there's too much movement, I find, and too much busyness, it diffuses what's actually, coming out of your head and heart. And I think in the case of those two numbers, they also happen to be two of Huey's richest songs, that they feel like they're written for theater. When we found Only One, we were gobsmacked, because it was about a guy and an alcoholic father and an accident, and that was not rewritten at all. That's exactly as it was. And it was just so strong that, I learned a long time ago. I did one of the first show I did in New York was called Jacques Brel's Alive and Well Living in Paris. And it's a show I loved since theater camp when I was a kid. And my mother kind of went to college in France. And so I knew Brel and Piaf, and I was in love with all those kind of chansons. And what I learned pretty quickly was that the greatest storytelling often comes out of simplicity, and you have to know where to spin plates and where to, draw curly cues and decorations, and where to just let something speak for itself. And if you've ever watched, I mean, it's funny, I even showed Corey some of Jacques Brel's performances because I'm such a fan, but you watch the actual man singing in the 1950s in France, and it's just him in a spotlight in a black suit. And he, by the end of a 3-minute song, he's sweating. He doesn't move, but he's drenched in sweat because there's so much kinetic truth coming out of him that he's leaving it all. It's the definition of leaving it all on the stage. And that's kind of what Corey gives us, and Mackenzie. They're both such fine actors and artists that they really do. They give so much that if I had them move around more, we would get less of them.
Yeah, that's a great point. And they come across so perfectly on the stage. It's two really terrific numbers. Before I let you go, Gordon, I want to ask you too, this is your return to Broadway after I think 8 or so years since your last production in New York, or I should say on a Broadway stage in New York. What does it feel like to be back on Broadway, and specifically with this show, which, as you said, is really joyous and just full of heart and emotion and fun?
It's especially uh, gratifying um, and just delightful to be here after. I mean, the last two shows I did were Crime and Punishment, and before that, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and so just being back in this space of joy and generosity of spirit is so just such a treat and an honor. And I think the pandemic kind of gave us all both some perspective on theater versus life, and how the two kind of feed off of one another. And just living in a pandemic world made us so grateful for theater, especially when I reached a point where I feared I would never be back inside of theater. And then I went in and started writing TV, and that's where we developed the Andy Cohen show for NBC. And out of the blue, I got a call in the middle of it to just go to Paper Mill and film a show I had directed a long time ago. And I walked inside, I mean, it's so corny, but I just started weeping. I was like Norma Desmond. Hi, Hawkeye. I was so happy to be in a theater. It's my happy place. And it could be a 99-seat theater, or it can be Broadway or the West End, and I'm equally happy. And so this is everything I could have hoped for.
Yeah, it's really a fun and joyous return. Gordon Greenberg, congratulations on the Heart of Rock and Roll. Thank you so much for talking to Gold Derby today.
Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.